a good place to start could be, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is John McBride. I'm a senior software engineer at OpenSauced. I've spent time at AWS and was at VMware and Pivotal before the acquisition, worked on a bunch of cloud technologies, but I also maintain SPF 13 Cobra, which is a Go command line interface library in the Kubernetes and CNCF ecosystem. I've been all over the place, but yeah, do a lot of code, work in the cloud space, and yeah,
And you have a talk as well at KubeCon,
yeah.
North America. Because maybe before we go into the talk, what are some of the different kinds of threats that people can think about or they should consider for a Kubernetes cluster?
Sure. Oh, goodness. Where to start? One of the things that you end up thinking about when you're like deploying apps to Kubernetes is you aren't just putting stuff onto a server. You're putting stuff onto like a whole stack of software that then gives you orchestration and availability and all the stuff we love about
Yeah.
Kubernetes. Your threat models end up being like tenfold at that point. There's container escapes, which are probably the scariest, but also the least likely because those are like the 0-day vulnerabilities that exist within like Linux and the nodes that your Kubernetes is running on top of. Those are the most scary, but probably the least likely to happen. Maybe the not as sexy, but just as scary and happens more frequently is just misconfiguration. Like, oh, I accidentally gave this role to the wrong user or the wrong service, and now it has an escalated role. Some pod that I'm running, somebody's experiment off of GitHub or something that I'm running on my Kubernetes cluster now has elevated access or elevated service roles essentially in there. So misconfiguration is not as sexy to talk about, but that's probably the one that should be talked about more.
And what's your talk about?
So my talk is about essentially using social engineering and zip domain that I bought.
Yeah.
It's actually kubernetes.zip that I got, and using that to hack the Kubernetes software supply chain. Yeah, a lot of social engineering involved in that and a lot of kind of perfect elements that came together to put this proof of concept together, basically.
Wait, so tell that to me again, because now technically .zip domains are available for people to buy.
Correct,
It's pretty
correct.
fairly cheap as well. How did you, like, what was the flow of
Yeah,
how
yeah.
these kinds of attack of sequence happened?
That's a good question. And it's weird because the layperson probably doesn't know a lot about, oh, Google started offering this top level domain. But
Yeah.
in May of this year, Google Domains started offering .zip top level domains. And I could go and buy like John's Cool Website.zip or Pod Security Podcast.zip.
Yeah.
And you go to that as a website, just like you would like mywebsite.com or something. The really kind of thing that I think a lot of people raised a red flag about was this is just confusing. It just makes the internet less of a safe place to be because there's already file extensions, .zip file extensions. You might download some photos as a zip or some code as a zip.
Yeah.
And even off of GitHub, you can get zip bundles of code just off of GitHub.
Yeah.
And that's something that the Kubernetes ecosystem does. A lot of releases have zip files as sort of code artifacts. And so my idea was like, I'm going to buy kubernetes.zip for $12
Yeah.
and start using that to, initially I told people about it because I was like, hey, I bought this domain. We probably want to do something safe with it. So
Yeah.
initially I just redirected it to kubernetes.io because
Okay,
I wasn't
right.
going to do anything with it. But I realized there was a proof of concept, social engineering hack involved in this where like, oh, somebody could use kubernetes.zip to say, hey, there's a big vulnerability. We have to release code right now. Here's the zip file, kubernetes.zip.
Yeah.
Click this now and do the release. You would click it, get the Kubernetes bundle of code, build it,
Yeah.
release it, but it was not actually from GitHub. It was maybe something that I had that I injected little bits of code to. It could have been anything. I could have injected code into Kubelet or
Yeah.
kubeadm or kubectl, and all of a sudden all your clusters belong to me because you used some code that I socially engineered using kubernetes.zip to get you to download and use.
Wait, so is there a way to detect this or?
Yeah, if you're doing even the most basic of checks, doing SHA-SUM checks against the zip file or any of the code from Kubernetes, say, okay, Kubernetes will give you a SHA-SUM check, SHA-256 or something.
Yeah.
You might check that and say, okay, does this SHA-SUM check that Kubernetes is saying is legit match what I get from this zip bundle of all this code?
Yeah.
If they match, then you're assured that they're the same. If they don't match, then you know that there's some code in there that's not. There's some diff. There's something that doesn't match up. If you're doing that, then you would catch that. Most modern day browsers will also tell you if you're like being misdirected in a weird way to like different websites.
Okay.
But that's where the big social engineering part of this comes in. If you get some email from your boss or from your principal engineer to say, we got to do this right now.
Yeah.
Like, we got to get this release going. We got to ship some Kubernetes. Here's the link to the release. Let's ship it. You're just going to guess. You might not do the SHA-SUM check.
Yeah.
For my talk, I think the big kind of poster point about it is that software without software validation is just risky. If you're going to use some software that you haven't validated in some automatic way, that's just a problem. And this could go for some Kubernetes bits that you're downloading. It could go for just curling something into Bash or even just doing, Docker run somebody's random container.
Yeah.
Like that's just an open invitation for some messy, vulnerable code to land on your system somewhere.
I guess adding another layer to this as well then. So there is capability to detect it, but software supply chain in itself is like a big topic as well. What are your thoughts on that? And obviously Kubernetes.zip was a good example of how it could be misused in the wider context of Kubernetes. Software supply chain, how is that being addressed in your opinion at the moment, and maybe what's missing as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. The supply chain at large is more or less this bit maybe consumes that bit, and then it creates this like long pipeline, this long chain that might get you an actual like vendor service that you can use. That's inevitably where you get EKS. But in that long pipeline of stuff, there's a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
There's a lot of projects involved. And anytime you involve people very intimately, like you're just going to have those kind of problems, those kind of trust issues. So in my opinion, I think probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities within just the supply chain at large is just a lack of maintainers and a lack of people. If we're inherently trusting this supply chain of stuff going from A to Z, and there's individuals involved in there who maybe have malicious intent, or their accounts get compromised or something, they could be that like single piece inside of the chain that ends up just flowing all the way downstream to some major service. Those are very hard to detect. So maybe I'll say that's twofold. It's just there's a people problem. There's just not enough people involved. And then there's also like a detection problem. It's really hard to introspect that long chain of like, where do things come from and how can I be assured what I'm getting is actually what I want and what I need?
Especially in an open source context as well. There's a lot of high trust being involved in it. And maybe another one, and when you and I connected, we spoke about how single contributor into a project as well. Could you share a bit about that story that I think you spoke about last year as well?
I did, yeah. So at KubeCon EU in 2022, my talk was about the risks of solo maintainer dependencies. And that's what I'm talking about there is those projects that maybe have just one or two or very small groups of people contributing into them where they're the ones with the keys to the castle. They're the ones with the big key to the city, and they can have all sorts of ways to make things just terrible for people down the supply chain. The worst case for that would be where some malicious actor gets a hold of somebody's account. And I'll use myself as the example where I maintain SPF 13 Cobra. It's actually gotten much better these days because there's a smaller cohort. For a long time, it was just me. And something that kept me up at night was like, okay, what happens if some nation state actor gets a hold of my account, really goes after me, they're going to get my account. They could inject some malicious commit deep into Cobra, deep into the commit tree that like you wouldn't see it on the surface unless you were doing some like major Git surgery or something. Then they could cut a release that would be consumed directly, and then that would get shipped as part of some Kubernetes service to Google, Amazon, Azure, et cetera. And boom, the world is owned. And that's something that as a solo maintainer, it's like, oh, wow, I could be that single chain in the supply chain that breaks to cause a massive vulnerability. Now, I think that story is very dramatic, and I'll play my own devil's advocate because there are people watching these things. I think if somebody saw that, oh, John just force pushed to Cobra to drop some weird commit in here, what's going on with that? Like, it would get picked up eventually. I'm very unassured that it would get picked up immediately, I guess is what I'm saying.
So to your point, the detection becomes even harder. So where should people start? This is my final question as well, because I almost wonder that where do you even start building trust in open source as well? Like, I think what would be one way? Because obviously we are in KubeCon, we were talking about this earlier, how many people are here, and a lot of them truly believe open source, and rightly so, it's a community, so there's a lot of trust hanging in there as well. But for a lot of people who are probably enterprise, they want some assurance that I can call someone and go, hey man, did you work on that code? Or do you need help with it? Can I contribute into it? Like, where do people start with that when it comes to open source so that they can start building trust on it?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, I think, honestly. I don't know if there's a great solid answer for it right now. I think there's some hard answers where like companies could begin to invest more into projects that they intimately rely on. And I think Kubernetes services are a great example where big clouds are shipping Kubernetes services that you could consume, and they're making X whatever dollars on that. And I would love to see more of that invested back into the communities and back not only monetarily to help with literal infrastructure that the Kubernetes communities need, but also just engineering resources. And engineering resources are expensive, and making those allocations is hard. So I won't deny that that's a very hard thing to stomach. That's an unsolved problem. But to go back on my point about software, validating software, you do have to also invest, or you should start investing into solutions that can start to give you that kind of assurance. The most basic thing, like just doing shop checks. There's there's whole Kubernetes shops who just aren't, or just consuming straight up upstream Kubernetes, and it's just a riskier move to make. Start doing maybe the most basic thing, and then go from there. Start consuming images maybe that are built in-house that you can have signed by something like SigStore and SBOM, software bill of materials that flow downstream into your Kubernetes images and stuff. There's a lot that you could start doing with a lot of this stuff. And then you can continue to take that to the nth degree and start using other services to do monitoring and assurance of what's running on your Kubernetes and stuff.
Would that be different between a managed Kubernetes versus self-hosted one? Because I imagine a lot of people go, I use an AWS, I use Azure, I use Google Cloud. Would the open source conversation be a bit more different? This is assuming Amazon, Google, Microsoft are also doing the same thing that you mentioned. They're verifying where the thing is coming from.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think that, and maybe this isn't the most ideal solution, but the first thing that comes to mind is that if you're building on top of platforms that exist in the open source and are really fed by just free and open source contributions, then you should look deeply at your bottom line and how that flows into open source communities. Because say my terrible scenario goes as my nightmares presume, where, oh, John's account is hacked and he just somehow got something terrible into Kubernetes via Cobra. There's definitely a story where it's like, now our business is compromised, our bottom line is at risk. How could we have prevented that flowing into communities that need help and that need contributors?
Yeah.
So maybe not the most ideal solution. Again, that's a hard line to take. I do still think that there's a lot of trust that you end up putting in cloud providers, and doing your due diligence as well is important.
So maybe a good takeaway for cloud providers is that or maybe in general companies as well, just to look at the open source they use, and if there's anything which has a single contributor and potentially is of high value for the organization, that should be the first cab off the rank for, are we really using this, or do we really need this kind of thing? But this is good, man. Thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Where can people find you on the internet to connect with you and talk about the talk that you're giving at KubeCon as well?
Yeah, for sure. You can go to johncodes.com to get all the social links and stuff. I'm on X at johncodes. Bunch of Z's because John Codes normal was taken. You can find me on LinkedIn, John McBride. Yeah, I'm around johncodes.com as well.
I'll put that link in the show notes as well.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for coming in.
Hey, thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Thank you for everyone for watching, and I'll see you next episode. Peace.